It all began with a discovery that would shake the very foundations of archaeology. Following the unearthing of Tutankhamun's tomb by Lord Canavan, Sir John Willard and Mr. Beener of New York stumbled upon a series of funeral chambers near Cairo, deep within the shadows of the pyramids of Giza. The tomb they uncovered seemed to belong to King Menhera, an enigmatic ruler from the fading Old Kingdom. Little was known about this forgotten king, but the excitement over their find quickly became the talk of the world. The grave's significance was monumental, but so was the tragedy that followed. Sir John Willard, the leading archaeologist, died suddenly from a heart attack. The sensational newspapers didn't waste a moment in bringing back the old superstitions surrounding Egyptian tombs and curses. The infamous curse of the mummy was resurrected, and the press had a field day with the latest mystery. Barely 2 weeks later, Mr. Beener, his colleague, fell victim to a bizarre and fatal blood poisoning. Just days after that, his nephew committed suicide in New York. The rumors of a curse surrounding Menhera's tomb escalated into hysteria. The media dubbed it the Curse of Menhera, fanning the flames of superstition and fear. And then, Lady Willard, the widow of the late Sir John, reached out for help. Specifically, she turned to Hercule Poirot. The call for help was not only personal, but urgent. I accompanied Poirot to Kensington Square, where Lady Willard greeted us. Tall, thin, and draped in deep mourning, her grief was palpable. She wasted no time in explaining the reason for her distress. "Mr. Poirot," she began, "I know you are a detective, but more than that, you are a man of originality, a man of imagination and worldliness. I need your insight on something far beyond logic. What are your views on the supernatural?" Poirot, always deliberate in his responses, paused before answering. "Let us be clear, Lady Willard," he said. "You are not asking a general question. This is personal. You refer to your late husband's death, do you not?" Lady Willard nodded, her eyes filled with unease. "Yes. You see, 3 deaths have occurred, each one easily explained on its own, but when taken together, it's too much to ignore. And all within a month of the tomb's opening. Is it superstition? Or could it truly be a curse, an ancient force that modern science cannot explain? I fear this is only the beginning. My son, he's gone back to the site, determined to continue his father's work despite my pleas. I fear for his life. I fear for what may happen next." Poirot listened intently, his gaze sharp, before speaking with unusual seriousness. "I do not think you foolish, Lady Willard. I, too, know the power of superstition. It is one of the greatest forces in the world." Her voice quivered as she spoke again. "You believe that something supernatural could be at work? That the spirit of King Menhera is not at rest?" Poirot nodded solemnly. "It is possible. The forces of the past can be unsettling. But I will investigate. I will find the truth, no matter how improbable it may seem." And so, Poirot embarked on a quest to uncover the truth behind the series of mysterious deaths and the supposed curse. Was it really a matter of superstition, or was there a darker, more dangerous reality lurking in the shadows of an ancient tomb? As Poirot delved deeper into the investigation, the answers seemed to lead him closer to a chilling conclusion, one that would take him into the heart of a centuries-old mystery. As Hercule Poirot and I sat across from Lady Willard in her somber Kensington Square home, the air was thick with tension. Her grief was palpable, but it wasn't just the loss of her husband that haunted her. It was the relentless, gnawing fear that something darker loomed over her family. She had called upon Poirot not just as a detective, but as a man of vision, someone who could see beyond the veil of superstition and uncover the truth. "Do you believe in the supernatural, Monsieur Poirot?" she had asked, her voice trembling. "My husband's death, these deaths, Could they truly be the result of some ancient curse? Poirot, usually so unflappable, hesitated. For a moment, his sharp mind seemed lost in thought. Then he spoke, the words heavy with intent. "Lady Willard, it is not merely a question of belief," he said slowly, his voice grave. "Superstition is a powerful force. It can shape minds, twist fates, but that does not mean we should dismiss it outright. We must look deeper, at the facts." He continued, delving into the details of Sir John Willard's work. His passion for Egyptology had made him one of the foremost experts on ancient Egypt, while his colleague, Mr. Beener, was little more than a wealthy amateur. Yet the two men had joined forces on this monumental excavation, with Beener's money funding the endeavor. "And the nephew?" Poirot asked, turning to Lady Willard with a pointed look. "He had little connection to the project," she replied, her eyes clouded with worry. "I didn't even know of his existence until his death." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. He could sense there was more to this than met the eye, but Lady Willard's fear was not easily dismissed. She was convinced that her son, eager to continue the excavations, was in grave danger. "Do you believe the spirit of King Menhera is not at rest?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot's response was swift and direct. "I do not think you foolish, Lady Willard. I, too, believe in the power of superstition. It is one of the most potent forces the world has known." His words were a revelation. To hear Poirot, the master of logic and reason, speak so seriously of the supernatural was a rare thing indeed. For a moment, even I, ever the skeptic, felt a shiver run down my spine. As we made our way home, I couldn't resist asking Poirot about his views. "You truly believe in these things?" I asked, struggling to process what I had just heard. Poirot's expression was thoughtful, his mind clearly at work. "Yes, Hastings," he replied. "You must never underestimate the influence of superstition. It can take root in the most unlikely places and shape events in ways we cannot foresee." Later, Poirot took action. He cabled New York, seeking further details on Rupert Beener's tragic death. The reply was telling. Rupert had led a life of recklessness and dissipation, moving from one South Sea island to another, living off his inheritance. But what struck Poirot most was Rupert's return to New York. Penniless and angry, cursing his uncle for caring more about ancient kings than his own flesh and blood. The young man had turned his life around in Egypt, only to be consumed by guilt when his uncle's sudden death followed. The letter he left behind was filled with strange phrases, including one where he referred to himself as a leper and an outcast. The final line of the letter was chilling. "Such as I are better dead." Poirot's mind was racing, and I could see the wheels turning. I had my own theory, a theory of crime more modern than any ancient curse. What if Rupert had tried to kill his uncle, poisoning him in a fit of greed or anger? What if, in his guilt, he had taken his own life? It was a tragic, almost Shakespearean sequence of events, yet it seemed plausible. I shared my theory with Poirot, and he listened carefully, his eyes narrowing with interest. "It is indeed an ingenious theory, Hastings. It may even be true," he said, his voice tinged with approval. But then, his gaze hardened. "But you forget one crucial thing. The influence of the tomb." I paused, not sure what he meant. Poirot's belief in the supernatural had taken me by surprise, but his words left a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Could there be more to this than mere coincidence? Could the curse of King Menhera truly be at play? Poirot's gaze was distant as he mulled over the possibilities. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed that there was a deeper, darker force at work, something that went beyond simple greed or guilt. something that lingered in the air, unspoken and mysterious. The tomb had been opened, and the dead king had awoken. We were just beginning to peel back the layers of this intricate web, and already I could feel the tension building. What had started as an investigation into a series of tragic deaths was slowly evolving into something far more sinister, something that threatened to swallow us whole. The tension in the room was palpable, as Poirot's sharp eyes flickered with interest, a mix of curiosity and caution. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. I suspect something, a force greater than mere coincidence, a web of secrets that stretches back through the ages. We must go to Egypt. I stared at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. Egypt? Tomorrow? Poirot's response was an enigmatic smile that quickly faded into a look of mock misery. Ah, the sea, Hastings, the hateful sea, he lamented dramatically, clutching his chest as though the thought of crossing it was an unspeakable torment. But I knew better than to take him at face value. This wasn't about the sea. This was about something much darker. A week later, we found ourselves standing on the golden sands of Egypt, the scorching sun beating down upon us. I could feel the pulse of the desert beneath my feet, but Poirot, ever the meticulous man, was clearly suffering. His usual fastidiousness was replaced by a look of absolute misery. The 4-day voyage from Marseille had been torture for him, and the dry heat seemed to have sapped his usual energy. He had arrived in Alexandria looking like a shadow of his former self, his neatness abandoned in the face of the relentless desert. I could barely contain my enthusiasm as we entered Cairo. The city was alive with history and mystery, its ancient charm calling to me in a way that words couldn't quite capture. But Poirot, his ever-present clothes brush in hand, was consumed with a new enemy, dust. The man had no patience for the desert's golden grains that clung to his clothes, his boots, his very being. "Look at them, Hastings. My boots," he exclaimed in his trademark dramatic fashion. "Once shining with the neatest patent leather, now filled with sand. This is an outrage, an offense to my very soul." I couldn't help but laugh, but Poirot wasn't amused. "And my mustaches. They're limp, Hastings, limp. How can a man be expected to travel in such a state?" Despite the theatrics, I couldn't deny the strange magnetism of Egypt. The pyramids loomed in the distance, casting their ancient shadows over the city, and I could feel the mysteries of the past calling to me. Poirot, however, was not so easily swayed. "These pyramids," he muttered, surveying the landscape with distaste. "A shape so solid, so geometric, but look at their surface. It is uneven, unsightly. And those palm trees, do they not plant them in rows?" His complaints were endless, but I was undeterred. "Look at the Sphinx, Poirot. Surely even you must feel its mystery, its power." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "It has no air of happiness," he declared. "Half buried in the sand like that, it does not sit well with me." His words were ridiculous, of course, but they somehow added to the strange sense of foreboding that seemed to hang in the air. I urged him to forget the sand and focus on the journey ahead. We were to visit the excavation site, after all, and the camels were waiting. And so, off we went, traveling by camel through the unforgiving desert. I must admit, even I struggled with the bumpy ride, but Poirot, his shrieks could be heard for miles, a chorus of agony and disbelief. By the time we reached the camp, he had abandoned the camel altogether and opted for a donkey, his dignity in tatters. When we finally arrived at the excavation site, we were greeted by a sunburned man, his clothes bleached by the desert sun, his helmet casting a shadow over his weary face. He introduced himself as Doctor Tossell, a British expert, and the moment he spoke I could sense the gravity of the situation. "We received your cable," he said. "I'm afraid there's been an unforeseen event." Poirot's expression immediately turned serious. His hand froze mid-swipe as he checked his clothes for dust, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Another death?" he asked quietly. The answer came swiftly. "Yes, Mr. Schneider. Tetanus." A chill ran through me. The shadow of death had already claimed several of the excavation team, and now another had fallen victim to this insidious curse. I could feel it, an unseen hand at work, tightening its grip around us all. Poirot was silent, but his mind was already racing, assessing the situation. "This is unnatural," he murmured, almost to himself. "Tell me, Doctor, are we certain of the cause?" Dr. Tossell's expression was grave. "I believe so, but Dr. Ames will be the one to tell you more." I glanced at Poirot. "And Willard?" I asked, thinking of the man whose death had set everything into motion. No, replied Dr. Tossell. It was Mr. Schneider, not Willard. As we made our way toward the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was unfolding before our eyes. We had come here seeking answers, but I couldn't help but wonder if we were walking into a web of deceit, one that would be far harder to untangle than we had imagined. When we reached the large tent where Sir Guy Willard's body was being kept, I was struck by the air of quiet professionalism that surrounded the camp. Yet, beneath it all, I could sense the undercurrent of fear, the unmistakable chill of a curse, perhaps, or something even darker. And so, as we stepped into the tent, I knew this was only the beginning. The true mystery of the tomb, and the curse of King Menhera, was only just beginning to unravel. The air in the tent seemed to thicken as we were introduced to the new faces. The youngest of the trio, Sergei, sprang to his feet with an energy that contrasted sharply with the haggardness in his eyes. Despite his youthful appearance, his weariness seemed to age him, a man caught in the grip of something far greater than his years could comprehend. His introduction was followed by two others, Dr. Ames, an intelligent-looking man in his 30s, with a streak of gray at his temples that gave him an air of experience, and Mr. Harper, the lean, pleasant American secretary with the telltale horn-rimmed spectacles. After a brief exchange, Mr. Harper excused himself, leaving us alone with Sir Guy and Dr. Ames. Sir Guy looked strained, as though the weight of the situation was wearing on him. His voice was shaky, betraying his calm demeanor. "Please, ask whatever questions you must, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his eyes flicking nervously to Dr. Ames. "We are completely bewildered by this series of tragedies. It can't be anything but a coincidence." Poirot was already studying him, the silence in the room palpable as he weighed Sir Guy's words. "Your heart is truly in this work, Sir Guy, is it not?" Poirot asked, his voice quiet but unyielding. "No matter what happens, you are determined that the work shall continue, yes?" Sir Guy nodded stiffly. "Yes," he said, though there was a faint tremor in his voice. Poirot turned his sharp gaze to Dr. Ames, awaiting his response. "And you, Doctor?" Poirot asked. "What is your stance on this curious matter?" Dr. Ames, though composed, couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. "I am not for quitting either," he declared firmly. Poirot, ever the master of tact, raised an eyebrow. "Good," he replied, "but now we must get to the heart of the matter. When did Mr. Schneider die?" 3 days ago, Dr. Ames answered. "We are certain it was tetanus, absolutely sure." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Could it have been something else? Say, strychnine poisoning, for example?" Dr. Ames's response was quick, but his patience was beginning to fray. "No, it was clearly tetanus," he insisted. "We tried every possible treatment. The anti-serum, everything. We even got it from Cairo." Poirot's mind was already moving faster than the rest. "And what of the other deaths? The death of Mr. Biner. Was that related to tetanus in any way?" "Absolutely not," Dr. Ames replied. "He had a small wound on his thumb that became infected and led to septicemia. It wasn't the same thing at all." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he pieced together the puzzle. "So, we have 4 deaths, each one completely different. Heart failure, blood poisoning, suicide, and now tetanus." Sir Guy shifted uncomfortably, his unease palpable. "Yes, but what does it all mean? How can they possibly be connected?" Poirot's voice dropped, his tone ominously calm. What if there is something connecting them? Some act, some grave disrespect committed by these men, a disrespect toward the spirit of Menhera himself. The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Ames scoffed, clearly bewildered by Poirot's suggestion. "You must be joking," he muttered. "Are you suggesting some sort of curse?" Poirot remained unflustered, his eyes sharp as ever. "Science has its limits, Monsieur Ames. Do you truly believe that ancient Egypt's knowledge of the world was so primitive, so unscientific?" Dr. Ames opened his mouth, then closed it again, momentarily at a loss for words. His scientific mind could not reconcile the possibility, but there was no mistaking the flicker of doubt that crossed his features. Poirot pressed on, his voice softer now but no less insistent. "Tell me this, Doctor. What do the native workmen think of these deaths?" Dr. Ames hesitated. They believe in spirits, in things beyond our understanding. The white men may lose their heads, but they don't follow the same rules." Poirot looked at Sir Guy, his expression unreadable. "And you, Sir Guy? Do you truly believe there is nothing to this nonsense, as you called it?" he asked pointedly. Sir Guy's face twisted in disbelief. "You cannot mean to say you believe this curse talk, Poirot. This is madness." Poirot's eyes, however, were unyielding. He had his suspicions, and with every word the threads of the mystery began to tighten. There was something at play here, something far darker than any of them had imagined. The question was not if it was connected, but how. As I stood there, caught between Poirot's unshakable confidence and the doubts of the men around us, I couldn't help but wonder. Was there truly a curse at work here, or was it something far more human? A web of lies, deception, and motives long buried in the sands of Egypt. Only time would reveal the truth. But one thing was certain. The answers lay buried, and we were determined to unearth them. "Oh, but this is absurd!" Dr. Ames exclaimed, his voice rising in disbelief. "You cannot truly know anything about ancient Egypt if you believe in such things." Poirot, unshaken by the outburst, calmly retrieved a small, worn book from his pocket. As he held it out, I could see the title, The Magic of the Egyptians. The sight of it only deepened the mystery, as Poirot's expression remained as inscrutable as ever. Without a word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the tent, leaving us in stunned silence. Dr. Ames, clearly baffled by Poirot's actions, turned to me. "What's his little game, then?" he asked. I smiled faintly at the familiar phrase. "I'm not sure, but I believe he's working on a plan to exorcise evil spirits, perhaps." I shrugged, unsure of how to explain Poirot's mysterious ways. I left the tent in search of Poirot and found him engaged in conversation with Mr. Harper, the expedition's secretary. Harper was talking about Mr. Willard, describing him as a man who had fiercely protected his life's work. The old man was very clear, Harper said. He intended to leave his fortune to support the expedition. Nothing for his nephew, not a cent, not even after his death. "And what about the nephew?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but piercing. "Ah, yes, the young man arrived one day," Harper continued. "Not a bad-looking fellow, but the old man was furious when he turned up. They argued about money, about inheritance. I believe it was something to do with the work here, but the young fellow left almost immediately after the row." Poirot listened intently, then asked, "Was he in good health when he arrived?" "Young Blah?" Harper replied, "He did mention something being wrong with him, but nothing serious. I don't think it had anything to do with his health." "And is there a will?" Poirot asked. "Not so far as we know," Harper said. "Mr. Willard never got around to making one. But the old man, he was certain about his plans." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he processed the information. The young man's mysterious departure, the arguments about inheritance. It was all too convenient, too neat. But then Harper's next words took a darker turn. "I'm not staying," Harper muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I'll be gone as soon as I can. I don't care if it sounds silly, but I've heard the stories. That thing, Menhera, it'll get me if I stay here too long." Poirot gave a knowing glance over his shoulder, a peculiar smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "He is nervous," he said thoughtfully. "On the edge, yes. But it is not merely superstition that disturbs him." I raised an eyebrow but held my tongue, unsure of what Poirot was getting at. His cryptic words always left me wondering if he knew something I did not. Later, we were shown around the excavation site, the sun beating down relentlessly. Sir Guy's enthusiasm was evident, but I couldn't help but notice a faint undercurrent of unease in his movements, as though something or someone was lurking just out of sight. His nervous energy seemed to hang in the air like the oppressive desert heat. As we entered the tent assigned to us, a tall figure in white robes stepped aside with a fluid gesture, his presence serene and otherworldly. It was Hassan, Sir John Willard's former servant, who now served his son. His dark eyes glinted with a strange knowing. "You are the one they say is wise, learned in the ways of dealing with evil spirits," Hassan said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Let the young master leave this place. There is evil here in the air." Poirot, ever the skeptic but open to possibilities, took a moment before responding, his voice calm. "Evil, you say?" He turned to me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Yes, I feel it too," he murmured. Our meal that evening was hardly a cheerful affair, dominated by Dr. Toswell's enthusiastic discourse on Egyptian antiquities. But as the conversation wound down, Sir Guy, who had been unusually quiet, grabbed Poirot by the arm. "Look," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We turned to see a shadowy figure moving among the tents. It was no ordinary figure. "I recognize it," I gasped, feeling a chill creep up my spine. It was the same dog-headed figure I had seen carved into the tomb's walls, the image of Anubis, the god of the departed souls. Poirot muttered a quiet prayer as he crossed himself. "Anubis," he whispered, "the god of the dead." Dr. Toswell, clearly agitated, rose to his feet. "Someone is playing tricks on us," he exclaimed, his voice tight with indignation. "It must be a hoax." But Poirot shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "No," he said softly, "not a hoax. This is something else." The shadowy figure disappeared into the tents, and we rushed to investigate. The chase was futile. No trace of the figure could be found. Poirot's face remained inscrutable as ever, but I knew this was no mere trick. Something dark, something ancient was at play here, and we were mere pawns in a far more intricate game. With every step we took in the sands of Egypt, the mystery grew deeper, the shadows longer. and as the wind whispered across the desert, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. We searched high and low, but there was no trace of the shadowy figure. No sign that anyone had passed through the area. Returning to the camp, I was disturbed, unsettled by what we had just witnessed. But my unease only deepened when I found Poirot in the midst of his own preparations for safety. Around the tent, he was sketching complex symbols in the sand, diagrams I had seen before, repeated five-pointed stars, and strange inscriptions. His actions were deliberate, methodical. "Ah," Poirot said, with his usual calm demeanor. "We must be cautious, Hastings. The spirits of the dead are not easily dismissed." I stood by, watching as Poirot mumbled to himself, drawing intricate shapes in the sand. Dr. Toswell, his patience clearly worn thin, was fuming in the background. He walked over to me, visibly angry, his face flushed. "Balderdash, sir," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with derision. "Pure balderdash. The man's an impostor. He doesn't know the difference between medieval superstition and the beliefs of ancient Egypt. This is a concoction of ignorance and credulity." I tried to calm the irate doctor, but Poirot paid no attention to the outburst. He simply continued his work, his face peaceful as he prepared for whatever it was he felt was coming. Not long after, Hassan, Sir John Willard's servant, entered our tent, holding a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Poirot accepted it with a smile, nodding his thanks as Hassan offered him another cup. I, however, politely declined and returned to my post by the tent flap. As I stood there, gazing out over the desert, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of wonder. This place, this ancient land, held such an allure. It was as though the very sands beneath our feet whispered the secrets of a civilization long vanished, and I could feel myself becoming entwined in its mysteries. I turned to share this feeling with Poirot, but he was unusually quiet. It wasn't like him to be so still. I moved closer, only to find him lying motionless across the couch, his face twisted in a painful grimace. Panic surged within me as I rushed to his side. The cup of tea lay discarded on the ground beside him, its contents now empty. Frantic, I ran across the camp to Dr. Ames's tent, shouting for help. "Dr. Ames, come quickly." The doctor appeared almost immediately, wearing his pajamas. "What is it? What's happened?" he asked, his voice groggy but alert. "It's Poirot," I gasped. "He's ill. He's dying." Dr. Ames followed me quickly back to our tent, his brow furrowing as he assessed the situation. "Extraordinary," he muttered. "It looks like a seizure. What did he drink?" He picked up the empty cup. "What's this?" he asked. But just as he bent to examine it, Poirot's voice, calm and serene, broke through the tension. "I did not drink it," he said softly, causing both the doctor and me to freeze in shock. I turned in amazement to find Poirot sitting up, his face now calm, a slight smile on his lips. "No," he continued gently. "While my good friend Hastings was lost in admiration for the desert night, I took the opportunity to pour the tea not down my throat, but into a small bottle." Both Dr. Ames and I exchanged bewildered glances. Poirot, with his usual precision, had already taken precautions. "I will have the bottle sent to an analytical chemist," Poirot added. "It will tell us what poison was in that tea. No violence is needed, my friend." Before we could fully digest this turn of events, Poirot suddenly stiffened. "Ah, Hastings, quickly! Hold him!" he cried, his voice tinged with alarm. I rushed to his side, misunderstanding the urgency, but as I reached out to grab Poirot, "Doctor." Ames made a swift movement, his hand going to his mouth. The air around us suddenly filled with the unmistakable bitter scent of almonds. Dr. Ames staggered forward, his body swaying, before he collapsed to the ground. Poirot's voice, grave and steady, broke the silence. "Another victim," he said quietly, "but the last, perhaps. 3 deaths now rest on his shoulders." I stood there, frozen, completely stunned by what had just occurred. "Dr. Ames?" I whispered, hardly able to process the scene unfolding before me. Poirot turned to me, his eyes sharp with clarity. "You misunderstood me, Hastings. It was never about the occult influence. The true danger lies in the poison itself. Imagine this: a series of inexplicable deaths, each one linked to an ancient curse. The very air seems to pulse with an invisible menace, and the whispers of a forgotten civilization echo through the desert night. But, as Poirot reveals, superstition is a powerful thing. Once it takes hold, it can distort the truth, turning a simple tragedy into a tale of supernatural retribution. From the beginning, Poirot suspected someone was manipulating these fears. He was right. The death of Sir John Willard sparked an eruption of superstition, yet there was no clear motive. It was young Mr. Blair, the nephew, whose death turned the tide. His tragic end, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, driven by a belief that he had contracted leprosy, was nothing but a carefully orchestrated ruse. A ruse crafted by someone close to him, someone who stood to gain from his demise. Poirot's deductions were sharp, and they pointed directly to Dr. Ames. With a sinister precision, the doctor had spun a web of lies, using the young man's desperation to secure a fortune. Ames had inoculated him with the deadly germs of a disease that didn't exist, and then watched as the boy, in despair, took his own life. The chain of events didn't stop there. Dr. Ames, calculating and cold, knew that the next death, young Willard's, would fuel the belief in the curse. The supernatural aura surrounding the tomb of Men-Hara would deepen. And Poirot, ever the clever strategist, decided to test the waters himself. The jackal-headed figure that so terrified us in the night. It was all a theatrical act. Hassan dressed up to play the part of Anubis, the Egyptian god of the dead, a psychological trick designed to unnerve the doctor. But Ames was no fool. He was never swayed by the theatrics. Poirot's brilliance was not in his beliefs, but in his understanding of human nature. He knew that a murderer, once successful, craved the rush of repeating his crime. Ames would stop at nothing to eliminate the next target, Poirot himself. But our intrepid detective wasn't so easily defeated. His gray cells worked relentlessly, and the truth came to light. In a twist that could rival any supernatural tale, Poirot uncovered that young Blair had, in his drunken stupor, written a will years ago, leaving his possessions, including a certain cigarette case, solely to Dr. Ames. This seemingly innocuous detail was the key to the doctor's twisted scheme. A will, a curse, and a series of deaths, all masked as the vengeance of an ancient king. But Poirot knew better. The truth was far darker, and it was this very truth that revealed the true face of the murderer. So, what did you think of this thrilling mystery? The tension, the twists, the brilliant deduction, everything that makes a great story unforgettable. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting adventures. Stay tuned for our next mystery, because with Poirot, there's always more to uncover. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.